Order. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. This morning we have the Department of Environment with us as a witness to discuss the Auditor General's November 1st, 2017 report, which focused on environment issues in the province. I'd like to remind everyone to place their phones on silent. We will start with introductions. We do have a member who's celebrating a birthday today, Mr. Horn. Happy birthday to you. We'll begin with Mr. McKay.
Good morning and welcome back. It's Hugh McKay from Chester St. Margaret's.
Bill Horn from Waverley Fall River Beaver Bank. I'm filling in for Mr. McGuire.
Benjamin Jessom, I represent Hammonds Plains, Lucasville. Good morning.
Good morning, Suzanne Lonescroft, Lunenburg.
Morning and welcome, Gordon Wilson, the MLA for Clare Digby.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good day, Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobequid.
Good morning, Lisa Roberts, the MLA for Halifax Needham.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, in your chair. We have the Auditor General's office with us this morning, and it includes the coach of the World Junior Women's Curling Champions. So congratulations, Mr. Atherton. Allow Mr. Pickup to introduce yourself and Mr. Atherton.
Hi, I'm Michael Pickup, Auditor General, and I only coach audits, so.
And Mr. Atherton.
Hi, I'm Andrew Atherton, Assistant Auditor General.
Thank you. And our guests this morning are from our witnesses are from the Department of Environment, and we'll just start on the right with Ms. Roberts.
Lorrie Roberts, Executive Director of Policy with Environment.
Frances Martin, Deputy Minister of Nova Scotia Environment.
Adrian Fuller, Executive Director of Inspection, Compliance and Enforcement.
Andrew Murphy, Executive Director, Sustainability and Applied Science, Environment.
Jason Hollett, Executive Director of Climate Change.
Ms. Martin, you may proceed with opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us here today to speak to the recommendations of the November 2017 Auditor General report. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the senior team that's here with me this morning to ensure that we're able to fully address all the questions you have. And additionally, I'd like to thank the staff in the Department of Environment who are located throughout the province and work day in and day out on behalf of the environment. Every day at the Department of Environment, we use science and expert opinion to make decisions with one goal in mind, and that's protecting the environment and the health and safety of Nova Scotians. We have a great deal of regulatory responsibility. We enforce 35 acts and more than 85 sets of associated regulations. They cover air, land, water protection, matters of public health, animal welfare, wildlife conservation, and aquaculture, just to name a few areas of responsibility. We conduct more than 22,000 inspections in a year, and about a third of those are related to enforcement of the Environment Act. We take this responsibility very seriously, and when the Auditor General makes recommendations for improvement, we listen and we take action. In the Auditor's 2017 report, the Auditor General gave us recommendations on our climate change program and on our environmental assessment process. We welcome these recommendations, and we're working hard to ensure that we address them and continue to improve. Focusing on climate change for a minute, I am pleased to report that we've already made progress on the 3 recommendations related to climate change. Our primary focus on this front for the past 2 years has been building our cap and trade program to meet the federal requirements for a price on carbon by 2019. That's January of 2019. This is a tight time frame, and it is a massive amount of work. This work will help us with the Auditor General's recommendations for more public reporting. In May, we will be getting greenhouse gas data from Nova Scotia companies, and most of it for the very first time. This data will feed into our annual reporting on the cap and trade program. And once it begins, we will be required by law to report to Nova Scotians on this program each and every year. Once the cap and trade program is in place, we will turn our attention to publishing progress updates on all climate change work on a regular basis. Our next scheduled update will be in 2019. We will also continue to report every year on climate change goals. And we will do this in two ways. One is as we have done under the Environmental Goals and Sustainability Act, and the other is through the Environment and Climate Change Canada as well, the federal department. As the Auditor General noted, we have already accomplished most of the actions and the goals that had been set out related to climate change. This represents a great deal of work done by many government departments, by the electricity sector, by municipalities, and by individual Nova Scotians who've changed their habits and have made investments to help us fight climate change. Of course, there's always more work to do, and we're committed to developing and updating the plans on key areas of focus every 2 years. We are currently working with the Department of Agriculture, for example, to identify issues and opportunities for that department and that sector. Once this is complete, we will work with other departments to identify the next key areas of focus in 2019 and 2020 and beyond. It's important to periodically review our ranking in terms of climate change risk. And while the types of climate change risks for Nova Scotia have not changed, their probability and potential effects may have. We've committed to reviewing our risk ranking every 5 years based upon the latest science. We will conduct the next review in 2019. Moving on to another important area that was subject to the auditor's review, and that is environmental assessment, or EA as we call it. We follow the process that's set out in the Environment Act and the regulations. We review projects that are submitted to determine if they meet our environmental standard. This is a robust process, and it includes an opportunity for public comment and expert input. Also, it should be noted that for most projects, the environmental assessment is the first step. There are other regulations in place to ensure that once the minister has made an EA decision, that there are approvals in place to ensure that the environment is protected. Almost every project that requires an EA approval also requires another type of approval. Often this can be, for example, an industrial approval. It should give Nova Scotians the confidence to know that our regulatory work is much broader than the EA process itself. And while our EA process is robust, it is just one part of a bigger system to protect the environment. The main issue in our EA process that the Auditor General identified was that we needed to do a better job of documentation. When he looked at a sample of EA terms and conditions, he didn't find documentation to verify that we had followed up to ensure compliance. Since his report, we have reviewed the terms and conditions, and we are confident that we have followed up on all of the terms and conditions in our EA process. Further, I am pleased to advise that we have already completed all but 2 of our actions to address the 7 recommendations. And those relate to EA approvals, including terms and conditions, are now entered into our computer system known as SNAP. That's the System for Notification and Processing. This allows staff in different divisions of the department to track terms and conditions and ensure compliance. We've also updated our EA checklist to maintain a record of communication with other departments on each project. And the last point to focus on, we are now using a routine sheet to document the information sent to the minister for decision on each project, as well as the decision itself. So that is following through on the specific EA recommendations. We've nearly completed our update of our internal guide for following up on EAs, and it's in the final stages of completion and will be completed very soon. And then lastly, we are well underway with our review of the standard terms and conditions that we will include in environmental assessment approvals. Our EA and compliance staff are working together on these recommendations and this project to ensure we will complete it in the coming fiscal year. In terms of the previous audits, the Auditor General also commented on a variety of our previous audits. We have completed more than half of those recommendations, and all of the rest are underway, and we will be complete on most of those in this coming fiscal year. The Auditor also commented on accounting for contaminated sites in the province's financial statements. He found that the Department of Finance is properly accounting for these sites in accordance with the Canadian Public Sector Accounting Standards. He also considered the Boat Harbour cleanup, which we will talk about, I'm sure, and we did talk about when I was here about a month ago, and if you have any further questions on that, I'd be glad to speak to you. So in closing, my colleagues and I are here today, and we're happy to answer any questions on the AG reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. We'll start with the PC Caucus. Mr. Houston, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for those introductory comments. Deputy, when did you join the department as the Deputy Minister?
I joined in February 3 years ago.
Okay, and at that time when you joined, there was a series of Auditor General recommendations that really hadn't been attended to. Let's say, were you surprised by the number of recommendations that were outstanding?
So when I joined 3 years ago, there were a number of reports that had been completed by the AG. Drinking water, contaminated sites would be two of those that come to mind. And I certainly was updated by the staff in the department in terms of the progress on those reports. I think I was impressed with the work that the department had completed, and I also recognize, and we can get into more detail later, in some instances it was necessary in order to meet the Auditor General's recommendations to put in place new regulations. And that's a fairly extensive process, which starts with the review of a program, with the development of a discussion paper, with consultation with stakeholders and so on. So what you're seeing here today is the culmination of a considerable amount of work over time, and we have made substantive progress on and completed a number of the recommendations. Mm-hmm.
No doubt some of the recommendations are more onerous to comply with, but some aren't, and we're talking about things like drinking water and food safety. They're pretty serious issues for Nova Scotians, and it just strikes me as disappointing, I guess would be a word, that some of these recommendations that the Auditor General comes up with can take years to address. I don't think Nova Scotians have a great deal of confidence in the Department of the Environment and many of the bigger files, and when you see the recommendations kind of sit there for years, it doesn't help that. So how do we get to a point where recommendations kind of sit there from the Auditor General just for years? Is it a lack of are they not prioritized, or what would be your sense as a new deputy coming on into the department and seeing these recommendations? Was it a priority of yours to act on some of those?
It's always a priority to act on the recommendations from an AG report. Just to pick up on a couple of your comments, I have every confidence, and Nova Scotians should as well, in terms of the safety of our drinking water and its quality, as well as food safety and other aspects of environmental protection. You certainly hit on it in your question to me, and that is there are a variety of recommendations that are quite complex, and they do take time to complete. Certainly there are simpler ones, and the simpler ones tend to get addressed pretty quickly. In fact, it's not unusual when a Auditor General report goes public that there would be some recommendations that have already been acted upon. So I indicated in my earlier answer, there are times when we need to put new regulations in place. That takes time because some of the important steps in putting forward new regulations or if we need significant new policies, it's really critically important to conduct a thorough consultation with stakeholders, and all of that takes time, and we need to, in addressing the recommendations, make sure that that we get the details right. So that that does take time. But if you look at the recommendations that are in the chapters that are in front of us today, you'll see that we have either completed or are making substantial progress on all of the recommendations.
What about, there's a recommendation from the May 2014 report around drinking water. The Department of the Environment should evaluate whether the current requirement for water testing by inspectors at registered facilities is appropriate and implement changes where required. So the recommendation is that the department should evaluate whether the current requirement for testing is appropriate. And that's a recommendation from May 2014, and as of February 2017, that recommendation was not complete. Is that recommendation complete today? Has the department evaluated whether the current requirement for testing is appropriate?
Can I just clarify which number that recommendation is?
That is from the May 2014, right. Chapter 5. It's 5.5. 5.5.
Sure. Yes, and in fact, we have completed that piece. When we look at standards associated with drinking water, we rely quite heavily on our colleagues across Canada. I think I mentioned when I was here before, we have the Canadian Council of Environment Ministers. They, for many, many years, have been working on the science and evidence associated with what standards are appropriate and safe in terms of drinking water. And we adopt those standards. And so in the process of adopting those standards, we build requirements into approvals for municipalities, which are largely who we're regulating here, and also as this recommendation implies, we go on and do internal reviews to make sure that we are in fact following the procedures in the department.
So from the department's perspective, I guess when the Auditor General comes back and looks again, that will say complete.
That will say complete, yes. 5.5, yes. Okay.
In your opening comments, you mentioned the follow-up on the terms and conditions. A number of projects are approved with terms and conditions, and the Auditor General reported that his finding was basically that there was very little follow-up on terms and conditions. You addressed that in your opening comments, and you said that the department has now you used the word followed up on all terms and conditions. In that follow-up, did you find that all of the terms and conditions had been met?
If you're asking globally about all of the recommendations that are in front of us today, what I would say is that when we do our internal reviews...
Sorry, no. So what I remember from the Auditor General's report last time was that most projects had been approved. I forget the numbers. It was like 43 of 52 or something had been approved. It was my feeling from hearing that was that if you apply for a project, it's probably going to get approved. That was most of them had been approved, and I don't have the numbers to hand, so I apologize. But my sense was that most of the projects that were approved with terms and conditions. So here's your approval, but you need to do this and this and that, right? And when the Auditor General looked at whether the department was monitoring the terms and conditions and whether they had been met, most of them weren't being followed. Like nobody was watching. Nobody was kind of tending the shop to see if the terms and conditions were being met. That was I don't have the numbers to hand, and you might recall, but of the projects that were sampled, there was no evidence in the file at the departments that anyone was watching to see whether the terms and conditions were actually met, and that was my general sense. And that was something that's been on my mind. In your opening comments, you referenced that the Auditor General's finding, and you referenced it in the context of saying that the terms and conditions, that the department had followed up on all terms and conditions. So in other words, the Auditor General noted that, hey, nobody's watching the terms and conditions, and I think you referred to that, I think that's what you're referring to in your opening when you said the department has now followed up on all those terms and conditions. So I'm asking specifically about projects that were approved with terms and conditions that the Auditor General initially said nobody's watching to see whether those terms and conditions are being acted upon or respected. And I think you referred to it and said that the department has now followed up on that, taken a look at that. And I guess my question is, in that follow-up, was everything okay, or did the department identify instances where there was terms and conditions? Maybe nobody had looked before, but when the department went to look, they're like, oh boy, they're not following the terms and conditions of the approval.
Ms. Martin?
I really appreciate you asking that question because it does give a good opportunity to clarify. So that was the Auditor General's report that was released in November of 2016, and it related to a review that the AG's office did on the environmental assessment. And what was identified was an issue related to documentation, that in terms of the files that the Auditor General examined, in those particular files that were examined, there wasn't evidence in those files of follow-up. Because of the critical importance of that, we did a follow-up review internal to the department of those specific files to ensure that there was in fact follow-up. Environmental assessment is a robust process, and if a project is approved, very often it is approved with terms and conditions. So it is those terms and conditions that then become important in terms of when that project leaves the planning phase and enters the real world, and often there's construction or some action that's taken. That's at that point, what we are looking at is, for example, other approvals in the department. It may be a water course alteration, it may be an industrial approval, what have you. So we agreed with the Auditor General that we did, in fact, have an issue in terms of how we documented those files. But we were thorough in doing our review to make sure that each and every term and condition in the EA process did in fact translate into a requirement in one of our other approvals. That was an important piece for us to satisfy ourselves with, and I can report here today that we did have evidence of continuity from the environmental assessment process into the approval process. And I had made reference in my opening comments to an IT system. We refer to it as SNAP. It's the System for Approvals and Notifications Processing. We have been using that system for over the past year. And we're quite confident now that because of that information being housed on environmental assessments and all of our other approvals in one IT system that we won't have questions into the future about documentation. But the key point here is, are we providing oversight and the appropriate environmental protection? In fact, we are through our approvals process, and we do have continuity between one and the other.
Thank you. You administer a lot of, you have a lot on your plate. I think you referred to 35 acts, and do you have the resources that you need to get the job done?
I feel very confident that we do have the resources necessary to do the job. And in fact, in 2016, we had a variety of other services transfer from other departments, agriculture, fisheries, natural resources, and the public health side of the Department of Health. And that has given us greater opportunity in terms of locating staff closer to where they need to be doing their inspections and work of that nature. And it's also allowed us in some instances to gain some efficiency through cross-training and so on. So, and as I said, with our new IT system, we're better positioned than we ever have been.
When will the When will the details of the cap and trade be worked out?
So that's a, as I indicated, that's a go live in 2019. And I'll ask my colleague Jason to give you further detail on that. But we have one a set of recommendations out. We have other areas that we're continuing to consult on. And Jason, can you give a...
Mr. Hollett.
Thank you for the question. As Deputy Minister Martin has said, we've done a lot of work over the past year on the cap and trade program. This time last year, we held our first consultation session. In the meantime, we have amended the Environment Act to give the Minister the authority to put together regulations. We also have passed the first set of regulations to require companies in Nova Scotia to report on the greenhouse gas emissions for the very first time. In terms of a go-forward plan, we're hoping to be out with consultation on the details of the cap and trade program later on this spring in order to be able to get the regulations in place in time to meet the federal government's deadline of January 2019.
The first set of regulations that you passed, are they public?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And has the department done an analysis of, like, is this going to reduce greenhouse gases, the cap and trade system, or what's your...
Yeah, so as part of the direction that's given by the federal government under the cap and trade program, we have to commit to have caps on greenhouse gas emissions from covered sectors, and those caps need to decline over time, so greenhouse gas emissions will need to decline.
And does the department have an analysis of how it's going to reduce in Nova Scotia over the next 10 years?
So right now we're in the middle of putting that work together, and those are the details that we'd like to consult with Nova Scotians and the industry and companies in Nova Scotia on.
And does the federal, when you have the analysis that says this is the plan, does the federal government have to sign off on that they agree to it?
Yeah, that's correct. So earlier in early January, the federal government, the Environment Minister and the Finance Minister sent around some guidance to provinces and territories on the process over the coming year for how they will work with provinces and territories on the implementation of carbon pricing. If you were to choose the federal government's approach, you had to notify them by the end of this month. For provinces and territories that are putting together their own systems, you need to submit the details of those plans to the federal government by September, on which they will evaluate using their own resources.
By September, okay. So there's going to be consultations over the summer, I guess?
Spring and potentially into summer. Those dates haven't been finalized yet.
So there'll be consultations, and then by September, the province will be submitting a plan to the federal government.
That's correct.
Okay, and then the feds will sign off on that, or not, I guess.
The feds will evaluate it. That's correct.
Yeah, and they'll evaluate that by January. Did you say?
Well, I think their intent is to have feedback back to the province as well in advance of that. If they don't accept the province's system, they'll have to implement the federal government's backstop.
So do you have any, obviously the government must think that the feds are going to accept their system.
Yeah, so the federal government's been fairly clear. They've released 3 sets of guidance over the past 18 months on what their expectations are to meet their carbon pricing benchmark. It started back in October of 2016. and they have released further clarification last August and then again early December. So we do have the guidance that they've published, and we are working to fit our program within that framework. So, and we do have regular conversations with our colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada on
okay,
those.
so you're trying to fit it into the box.
That's
You're
correct.
trying to make the cap and trade plan fit their requirements. So do you have a document that you can share with us that says this is the requirements of the federal government and this is where we are right now?
Yeah, we can provide either a link or the documents from the federal government that they've provided on the carbon pricing benchmark guidance.
And can you compare that to where we stand in Nova Scotia? Or you don't have that information as to where we stand in Nova Scotia yet, do you?
What I can provide is the 3 sets of documents that they've provided for the benchmark, and we have some discussion documents that we've put in place as well when we consulted on the cap and trade program last year, so we can provide that as well.
And those discussion documents would be the Nova Scotia situation as it is today?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
You still have about 40 seconds remaining.
Very kind of you, but I'll pass that to the NDP.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. Your department agreed to the Auditor General's recommendation that the department update plans and goals related to climate change. Just, I don't know if you can put a percentage on this, but how much of that effort is actually wrapped up in the developing the cap and trade system? Is that the substance of our work right now around climate change?
Ms. Martin.
A fair number of the AG's recommendations did relate to updating and public reporting, and so the aspects of public reporting are actually built right into the current set of recommendations that that we put in place, and thematically, it's public reporting it will be built into the work as we go forward.
I'm sorry, into the work of the cap and trade system, or into other work? I'm just trying to figure out if the cap and trade work is, to what extent is that our work on climate change in terms of, setting goals and our means for moving forward?
Right. So to answer your question, being transparent about our cap and trade system, what it is, how it's functioning, and so on, is built into the regulations that were put in place, and will be built into the future regulations that will be developed that frame the cap and trade system for Nova Scotia.
Okay, and so because of the system that we're building around cap and trade, would it be fair to say that we're not going to be setting goals, for example, related to transportation, related to reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, because transportation will not be captured under cap and trade?
I'll ask Jason to address the detail on that. Jason?
Mr. Hollett.
Thank you for the question. Transportation will be captured under the cap and trade program. The emissions that will be covered in Nova Scotia will be somewhere between 80 to 90% of the total emissions from the province. And our cap and trade program will be covering large industry, obviously the electricity sector, and fuel suppliers who provide the fuels for the transportation sector. So that will also be captured.
Okay. Thank you. So we can basically expect, as I understand it, new climate change goals in 2018. Is that what I heard earlier?
Ms. Martin?
I'd have to refer back to my comment earlier, but Jason, maybe you can take that question as well.
Yeah, we will have a new climate change program focused on the cap and trade program primarily in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the province.
But then we're going to be looking at the risks related to climate change and mitigation in 2019. And I'm just wondering why that order of things, you know, why aren't we setting goals in relation to the actual risks that are going to be happening?
Certainly. So maybe just to describe a little bit of the work that my team does. On the mitigation side, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, a significant portion of the work that we're doing right now relates to the cap and trade program, which will cap greenhouse gas emissions, require them to decline over time, and set up the rules and regulations associated with that. We also have a team that works on climate change adaptation issues. So that's preparing the province for the impacts of climate change that we know are going to happen, regardless of how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions here in the province. So that work continues. It definitely does not halt as we work on the mitigation side as well. We're working very closely with our colleagues in other departments and communities across the province. I think the recommendation that you're referencing is it relates to updating the risk profile of some of these things that we can expect that will continue to happen in the province. So the science becomes better year after year, and every once in a while you need to go back and reevaluate the risk profile of some of the impacts that we'll see to see if there are changes and to see if that requires any change in priority and focus for us.
So work on, for example, the Chignecto link, that critical infrastructure piece, that will be looked at in 2019. Is that right?
So that may be a piece that we're evaluating. You know, we've done lots of work with our colleagues across Atlantic Canada, and some of the work that we've done in concert with them and in our CAN was a study that identified some of the vulnerabilities that are associated with that link and the risks of climate change, including sea level rise and increased storm surge, changing precipitation patterns and extreme weather. So yes, we would absolutely be continuing that work.
Thank you. The Auditor General's report highlighted a gap in the department's thinking around climate change preparedness, especially regarding health impacts. So the department was not working with the Department of Health and Wellness to address expected increases in ultraviolet rays, outbreaks of West Nile virus. I guess we could add Lyme disease to that. Increased rates of respiratory problems. How has the department responded since to address that gap?
Yes, thanks for that question. So we work regularly with departments and agencies across the province to try to deal with issues as they arise. The impacts from a changing climate, and some of the ones that you listed there are really good examples of health impacts, are ones that we need to increasingly focus on our work. And I think that as we get into our commitments and our response to the OAG report, we committed to identify new areas of priority focus, and we've also committed to re-examine the risk profile of some of those issues so that we can understand which ones we need to spend more time focusing on.
Okay. I'm going to move to contaminated sites for my next series of questions. At public accounts here in February, the department said that as part of the environmental assessment process, Northern Pulp would have to explain why alternative effluent treatment systems like a closed loop system are not desirable or not possible. What criteria is the department using to determine whether Northern Pulp's reasons for not using a closed loop system are adequate?
Mr. Martin.
Thank you for that question. So what I indicated earlier related to closed loop or any other sort of technology is that in an environmental assessment process, it is quite a robust process that looks at a range of evidence and science. And one of the obligations on the proponent, in this case would be Northern Pulp, when they register a project, some of the information that we would be looking for is technical information and evidence related to alternatives. So if they are registering with one sort of solution in mind, we would expect as a part of the registration package to have an examination of what some of the other alternatives are.
Excuse me. So Northern Pulp has said that a closed-loop process is not possible because it is a bleached kraft mill. However, critics have pointed out that a closed-loop system actually would be possible if Northern Pulp shifted to producing unbleached pulp, which is a slightly different product, but also a product with a market. Would your department consider requiring Northern Pulp to shift its production process in order to reduce the environmental impacts of its effluent?
I would speak to generally the environmental assessment process. The very essence of it is to look at what the risks, what's being proposed, and what are the risk factors associated with it, and what's the best science and evidence associated with mitigating impacts. So that generally is what we would look for with any project that is registered. Northern Pulp has not registered a project yet, so I don't really want to speculate on what the content may be.
So it would still be possible for the department to judge that it needs a more robust argument to justify its lack of pursuit of an alternative, I guess. I'm just, in the Auditor General's report, it documents the escalating cost, the greatly escalating cost of the cleanup of Boat Harbor, and it does seem ironic that at the same time that we're investing a lot of money to clean up Boat Harbor, we're also, it seems likely to move forward on an industrial approval for an effluent treatment system, which will further contaminate, when there could be an option of a closed loop system that would not contaminate or would be treated on site.
Ms. Martin?
Again, I just reiterate from a process point of view that the environmental assessment process is quite robust. It provides opportunity for public comment. It does put obligations on the proponent to ensure that they've done their homework in terms of excuse me, and done their homework in terms of the details associated with the solution they're proposing, as well as the alternatives. Our department, at the end of the day, is keenly interested in ensuring that the environment and human health is protected. I can't really get into this stage related to any specifics around what may or may not be proposed.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Related to contaminated sites again, I'm somewhat puzzled that the Triangle Petroleum's waste ponds near Kennetcook from Nova Scotia's one experiment with fracking is not on the list of contaminated sites. My most recent understanding is that that company is not undertaking to clean up that site. And yet it's not on the list. So can you shed some light on why those 20 million litres of wastewater are not on the list of contaminated sites?
I'm going to actually ask my colleague Adrian to address that. Address that, please.
Mr. Fuller.
Yes, thank you, Deputy. That site actually has been cleaned up and remediated, and the material was taken out of those ponds and then treated in divert. So we would consider that not to be a contaminated site because it has been dealt with. I think that project completed I think it was sometime just before Christmas, but I'd have to confirm that as well, and we could get that back to you.
And was there, or where could we find a reporting on the amount of public funds that were spent to deal with that site? I didn't realize it had been completed in December.
Sorry, what was the question?
The question is, where can we find an accounting of the public expense involved in the cleanup of that project?
Again, that's something that I'll have to, well, you can get, I think it was, yeah, TIR was hooked to lead in the actual cleanup of that project, so we could, that would be the responsibility of that department.
Okay, thank you. Moving to a different recommendation from the Auditor General related to species at risk, because there was also a fairly recent Auditor General's report on that. The department, the Auditor General questioned whether there was an adequate assessment of the cumulative impact of different projects that might single in one by one, pass through the environmental assessment project. But what is the assessment of the cumulative impact? How is the department trying to capture and assess and mitigate the cumulative impact on species at risk?
Ms. Martin.
Thank you for that important question. We certainly work with our colleagues at Natural Resources, who are the lead on species of risk. But in our department, we have a fair amount of expertise to add to those discussions. One of the important steps the province is taking, and I think it's a real area of pride, is the commitment to setting aside 13% of our land mass for protected areas. We know that species are at risk because of the waterways and the old growth forests, the various habitats that they rely upon are intruded upon in one way or another. And so we have, we're over 12% now in terms of the part of the province that is set aside for protection, and we are committed and working hard to get to 13. So that would be a really significant commitment on the part of the government to be addressing species at risk.
Though the Auditor General's report shows that that's not actually proving to protect species at risk, because we continue to add more species to the list. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree that species at risk is certainly a complex area, but I would stand by protection of habitat is an extremely important component of protecting species.
Does your department consider environmental racism when assessing projects? Is there anyone in the department kind of looking at the department's work around environmental assessment through that lens?
Again, a very, very important area. In the Environment Act, we do have a commitment to public consultation, and in ensuring that all Nova Scotians have the opportunity when it comes to certain projects taking place, often some of the larger ones going forward. It's often a requirement of proponents that they need to have a community liaison committee in place, and that is a committee that would be representative of the community, that would have a special interest in whatever project it may be, and the obligation there to share information ongoing with those committees. So that is certainly that is built into how we do our work, and environmental assessment the same, 30-day comment period. So those are all opportunities to make sure that we are listening to Nova Scotians and their concerns about related to projects, and and we do weigh that information in terms of our decisions.
That would be in the case of a new project that is being proposed and going through the environmental assessment project. What about in the case of historic projects? I think, for example, of a dump in Shelburne, which has been in operation for decades, and which the community is very clearly identified as being an instance of environmental racism. Is there any resource in your department for communities to reach out to seek assistance in redressing cases of environmental racism where we're not talking about a new project with a new proponent?
Yeah, a good point of clarification there. Again, if it is an activity that is regulated by the department, and particularly if it's one that's regulated under some form of an approval, what's important in terms of how we relate to that is to ensure that that we are doing our utmost to make sure that the particular activity is meeting its commitments of its approval. So that may involve monitoring, it may involve other sort of reporting, and with the processes that we have in place, we identify projects based upon their a risk to the environment, human health, and schedule inspections accordingly. So that's a big piece in terms of if it's an existing facility or an existing activity, then we make sure that they're meeting their obligations under the Environment Act.
Order. Time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal Caucus. Ms. Lonis-Croft.
Thank you. And it wasn't too long ago we saw you here. And it was good to wake up this morning and read how we are hitting our targets here in Nova Scotia, in one of 2 provinces in Canada. And we are leading in Canada. So that's reassuring that your department is working hard and on your toes. The last time we met, there was an announcement about the hiring an environmental prosecutor. I find this very interesting. And I'm just wondering, where are you at with that? Have you drawn up terms of reference? Who would like to speak to that?
Ms. Martin?
Sure, I'll speak to that. Yes, that was a big announcement about a month or so ago, that there would be a dedicated prosecutor for the Department of Environment. So it's not only the Environment Act, but it's all the legislation and the regulations that we administer. At the end of the day, our mandate is to protect the environment and protect human health. And we do a considerable amount of inspections and enforcement, and I referred to some of those statistics earlier. So we know that the vast majority of proponents or citizens, if they're educated on what the requirements are, they will ensure that they're meeting their obligations under the legislation we administer. We do know that there's always a relatively small majority where we go through, a process of identifying what the requirements are and the graduated steps, and in some instances we do need to move matters to the court system. And so we're very pleased with the announcement and the commitment of this government to have a Crown prosecutor dedicated to the department's work. The Crown prosecutor is an independent. It's an independent service. And so they're in the process of putting together the competitive process to identify an individual that will take on that role. And so we don't have a date on when that person will be named, but we're very pleased, and it's a very, very positive move in terms of protection of the environment.
So this person would fall under the Department of Justice?
It's actually with the under Martin Hirschhorn's group, the Crown Prosecutor Service. So,
okay,
it's not the Department of Justice per se, I guess.
So you report to
the Public Prosecution Service.
Okay. Will there be a connection to you as Deputy Minister or the Minister of Environment as well?
There's a connection to my staff in the who report to Adrian, which is our field service. So those who are involved in inspections and insofar as we need to move matters to court, it would be our staff by and large that would be conferring with the dedicated prosecutor to identify which cases we ought to take to court and how we construct the best evidence and files to bring forward for successful prosecution. In addition to that, and this is an important piece of work that the Crown Prosecutor will do, and that is they will help train our staff. Collecting evidence, of course, for any law enforcement organization is increasingly complex, based upon case law and other matters. That's an important part of our job, and we need to do it very, very thoroughly and diligently. So the Crown Prosecutor will be very helpful for us in terms of professional development for our staff, so that when we go forward, it increases our chances of being successful.
So documentation, there was an issue around reported about documentation and that you are making improvements to that. So this should really help in the documentation process, especially with your compliance.
Yeah, and I guess it's just it's always, as you'd appreciate, when cases go to court, they get argued on both sides, and so the more thorough we are, the better chances are that we have for successful prosecution.
So will there be any way that a citizen can somehow contact this prosecutor, or is this all done within the department and through compliance and recommending that something go to the prosecutor?
So I guess from our perspective, the main advantage is that our staff, that when they see an alleged violation of our acts, the 33 that we are obliged to enforce, they have someone who will be knowledgeable on those acts. Your other question related to a citizen, I think that would really be a question maybe better answered by the Public Prosecution Service. I'm not sure exactly what those connections are.
Okay. So there's some self-reporting with compliance, aquaculture, for example, and I know that sometimes there's oil spills, while people are having their furnace tanks filled and whatnot. So how successful has self-compliance been with the Department of Environment? Because we always get questions on that as MLAs.
Yeah, that's a great question. In our department, we have about 230 people in Adrian's division. That's the field service, and it is their core responsibility to be out to inspect and to do the associated enforcement work. More eyes are always helpful, and we strongly encourage when citizens see something that may be a concern to them. We have a 1-800 number they can call, or easy for people to use the internet now with their smartphones and whatnot to contact our department. And we do have a rigorous process for following up on complaints, and that was certainly something that was the subject of one of the Auditor General's recommendations, is to continue to tighten up that process. And so if people see, if it's an oil spill or what have you, especially these can happen, for an individual homeowner, and chances are they'll be you know, they or their neighbors will likely be one of the first ones to see something like that. So for them to recognize that and call our department is extremely important.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to go on to your department's description is for your role is to protect the environment and by enforcing the regulations and educating companies about them. I think there's a lot of public misconception about the role of the Department of Environment, and as an MLA I get calls to my office, why isn't the Department of Environment on this file? Why hasn't the Department of Environment done this? Maybe we need to have a little discussion about regulations and law and the role you play, because I think there's a lot of expectation from the public that is misinformation.
Yeah, certainly earlier I'd mentioned that our role expanded quite a bit too in 2016 when we brought on services from agriculture, from fisheries, from natural resources, and the public health inspectors from the Department of Health. So we enforce a range of things beyond the environment per se. We play a really important role in terms of public health, you know, be it with Safe Body Art, which was a set of regulations that was released just recently, body art being tattooing, but a whole variety of other techniques, and it's important for that sector to have proper oversight to protect Nova Scotians. The whole area of food safety is one that we're involved in, and I'm sure, like me, you see more and more venues open for food establishments, and in the province we really benefit from a whole variety of farmers markets and so on, and so those are all areas that come under our area of responsibility, so important in terms of public health, and we have a system of oversight to ensure that that the safety is there. So so you are correct. We are Department of Environment by name, and yet we do a great variety of activities. But as I said, we're pretty easy to find, and if you or others have questions about what may come under our mandate and how we regulate in that particular area, we'd be glad to have that discussion at any time.
Okay, so when you take on a new project, you are usually working with TIR, I assume, and especially like a cleanup project. So can you sort of speak about what your role is in that? You're not actually doing the physical work. I think people are under the assumption that you do the physical work.
Yeah, that's a really good question and area of clarification. Department of Environment, we are a regulator, and to be an effective regulator, we certainly have to have our independence in terms of our staff that are appointed as special constables, and in so doing, when that allows them to do inspection and enforcement work, and as a part of that appointment, they have an obligation themselves to ensure that they are exercising appropriate professional judgment in following the legislation and regulations in the department, and identifying where they see infractions, taking the appropriate action. That does mean, as the regulator, we can't both design solutions and evaluate them at the same time, because we need to have that sort of independence. So we don't design solutions for how do we construct, a mine. How would we do the boat harbor cleanup, what have you. In the instance where those responsibilities fall to the province, it may be by and large Nova Scotia Lands or some portion of TIR that becomes the the proponent, and they're the ones responsible for doing all of the, or overseeing or making sure that the scientific work is done so that they can identify what they need to do in terms of managing a contaminated site, as an example. We would treat them as we would any other proponent, if they came from the private sector, in terms of what are the regulatory requirements, do they need an environmental assessment, and as well doing the inspection work and any compliance work that may arise from it.
Okay, so when you're doing environmental assessment, you have a Class A and a Class 1 and Class 2. Can you explain the differences and how would it switch? Do they ever switch over, like after, being a Class 1 and then finding out, no, this should be a Class 2? Or could you explain that in more detail for me?
Sure. Thank you for that. In the environmental assessment regulations, it lays out fairly clearly the distinction between a project that is Class 1 and a project that is Class 2. The Class 2 projects tend to be quite complex. They would be projects that would have the potential to have a significant impact on the environment unless they were properly regulated and reviewed. Examples of those would be the establishment of a new petrochemical facility, a brand new pulp and paper mill, fairly large industrial facilities, so those are, that's a longer process, mind you. A Class 1 project relates to, for example, a quarry 4 hectares or larger. It might relate to a modification to an existing industrial facility. In both instances, the minister is the decision maker, and the process is very well defined in the Environment Act in terms of how many days are available to the minister for review, how many days are available for the public for a comment period. And at the end of the day, any decision will be predicated on do we have the evidence and information to understand what the risks to the environment of a given project are, and more importantly, if the project is to proceed, what measures would we put in place to ensure that that project has the minimal impact on the environment. So it's a high-level overview of the 2 different classes.
Sure. So here in Nova Scotia, we have a Coastal Protection Act, which I understand, are we the only province that has that, or very few provinces?
I believe that if we were to enact legislation, I believe that we would be the only province with legislation to protect the coast. So you are correct. This is a commitment of the government to put in place a Coastal Protection Act. Nova Scotia, except for a small connection to New Brunswick, has a considerable amount of coast, and we recognize from our work on climate change, and in fact to the questions earlier around adaptation, this is an important piece of work that we're doing because we recognize that it works both ways. We have to protect Nova Scotians from the coast in terms of those storm events and so on, and we have to protect the coast for Nova Scotians in terms of some of the development that may occur that may not be beneficial for especially some of our more delicate coastal areas. Our department, I'm very pleased, we're the lead on the for the government to put together legislation to be tabled in the House. We're still in the early stages of that. We're benefiting from all of the research that others may have done, not only in Nova Scotia, and we do have a considerable amount of expertise in Nova Scotia on coastal protection, but we want to look to other jurisdictions in Canada and elsewhere across the globe, looking for the good examples. We do know that there are that there are provinces in Canada that have policies or guidelines related to the coast, but I'm not aware of other provinces that have actually enacted legislation.
Okay, I just want to quickly switch over to, I would like more questions coming from a coastal community, but the forestry industry was very excited to hear about the cap and trade when it was first announced. So you said that you've done some wide consultations. So have they played a role in your consultation process with the cap and trade?
They absolutely have played a role. We've been in discussions with the forestry sector from the very beginning of our work on the cap and trade system, and we've continued to consult with them, participate in some of their workshops and meetings across the province, and absolutely they are an ongoing part of the discussions as we continue our work in the development of a cap and trade system.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel we're in a good position for doing cap and trade? I know there's like talk about some foresters wanting to get a co-op together, so that they had a lot of strength and they could work together on this. Are you working with other departments like DNR and agriculture on this at all?
Yes, absolutely. We are working with all of the other departments in government, municipal affairs, and TIR, and so on across the board. Climate change, by definition, is a subject matter that, by definition, runs across a whole variety of parts of the province and departments' mandates. And so we have worked in the past intensively with them. As Jason indicated earlier, we're intensively working right now on the design of the cap and trade system. That's a big piece of work. We're regularly in touch with our federal partners in that regard as well. So there's a lot of players there, but important that we work with all of the interested stakeholders to make sure that we design the best system for Nova Scotia.
Order. Time has expired. I did allow it to go an extra few seconds there, as I often do.
Thank you.
Now we'll move back to Mr. Houston of the PC Caucus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your responses. The government has made more and more information available through portals on the internet for various things. Is there any opportunity to allow Nova Scotians to access more information and historical information about environmental issues through a portal? For example, if you're going to buy a property, could you maybe go through a portal? Could you envision a time when you go through a portal and check the environmental history of a property? Could you see, do you see a scenario where we're opening up environmental information to Nova Scotians?
Yeah, I'm going to ask my colleague Andrew Murphy to address some of the work that we've done there. I will say, though, in the Environment Act, we have written right into that act an environmental registry. And that was the commitment to ensure that there was key information that was made readily available to the public. But we've been moving, as the rest of government has, on open data. And Andrew's group is the one that oversees a lot of that information. So I appreciate him addressing the detail.
Mr. Murphy?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. So we provide both through our website and on occasion through hard copy materials various types of data and information to the public in Nova Scotia. We do that across many aspects of our mandate. And I'll provide some examples that illustrate where that information is provided. You know, on the food safety side of our mandate, we provide information on our inspections of local restaurants. So if you were to go to lunch after this session, you could go onto our website and look up your favorite restaurant and see information on our previous inspections. You could as well go on our website if you were interested in air quality information and wanted to know the quality of the air in Nova Scotia. We have a system of monitors across the province that monitor key air pollutants. That system is part of a broader national network. We do collaborate with Environment Canada on that. And so you could, at any point through the day, see the quality air in your community. We also have, through our portal, the ability to access previous information. So if you were a researcher, for example, you could go back and look at you know, a period of time for a particular pollutant and do studies on that. We also provide information and data on water, on both our surface and groundwater water supplies, which are important resources for the province. Another example will be solid waste. We provide data and information on the amount of waste diversion we have in the province, the amount of composting, recycling, and so on. The last item I'd mention, and these are just examples, there are others, we provide our industrial approvals online. So if you wanted to access an approval that we would have provided to a particular facility, you could go online, search for it, and you'd be able to see the terms and conditions, the length of time of that approval, and so on. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And what about, would you be able to get kind of animal welfare reports for food producers or breeders? Would that fall under your department?
That would fall under our department, that's correct. Yeah, animal welfare information, yes.
Then it'd be available online if you knew.
I'm not certain if we have animal welfare information online. I don't believe that we do. I'd have to check. No, we don't, sorry.
Okay, thank you for that. Deputy, are you familiar with the 2015 report, Taking Action on Climate Change? Mm-hmm. Has that report been updated, or is it updated on a regular basis?
That is a strategy that has not had a recent update. We will update it in time. However, since the federal government has put in place the requirement to place a price on carbon, that is where a fair amount of our effort is going to ensure that we get the right system in place for Nova Scotians, for the businesses that will be directly involved in the cap and trade system, and to ensure that it meets the requirements of the federal government. So that's quite a large piece of work. It's very intensive work, and so we do continue to do work because there's a variety of sides of climate change. Price on carbon is one side, adaptation is the other side, and we are continuing to work with our other departments and partners. Agriculture is one area that we've been working, and we've had some real successes in terms of working, identifying crops that will do well in terms of what's projected in terms of climate change. The wine industry is one of them. We've been working with agriculture there. It's been a great collaboration. Jason had mentioned earlier some of the other departments that we're working with. other aspects of agriculture in terms of dike lands and so on. So that will receive an update, but right now our intensive effort is going to meeting the commitment to have a system that's ready for 2019.
And in terms of greenhouse gas, the Perspectives on Climate Change Action in Canada report said that electricity production is our largest source of greenhouse gases. How can we reduce our greenhouse gases without addressing the source of the issue, which is electricity production?
Yeah, so Jason can speak to that in more detail. We are fortunate in Nova Scotia. That report did identify there are 2 jurisdictions that were meeting our targets, and one of those jurisdictions, of course, is Nova Scotia, and that's as a result of a considerable amount of work that we've done over a number of years, and agreements that we've had in place with the federal government related to electricity production. Jason, would you like to?
Mr. Hollett?
Thank you. It's a great question. The electricity sector is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the province, which is why we focused a significant amount of our action on that sector. So you may be aware that we have hard caps on the electricity sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It will require them to reduce their emissions by 25% by 2020 and 55% over half by 2030. So that's a regulated target that the electricity sector has to meet. That's reinforced by a lot of the good work from our colleagues at Department of Energy. They have renewable energy targets, 25% by 2015, which has already been met, and 40% by 2020, and some significant work on energy efficiency to reduce the amount of electricity that's consumed by Nova Scotians. So all of those pieces work together to help transition the province to cleaner energy sources.
Thank you. And there was a climate change risk assessment done in 2005 in the province, but has it been updated since then? Is it part of all? It's not been updated, or? It has not been updated. It's a document that we review on a regular basis internally. As I had mentioned earlier, the science around climate change is continually evolving and being updated. Most significantly by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, that's run under the United Nations. They regularly, through periods of between 5 to 7 years, provide updates on and cumulative updates on the science for climate change, after which we take and downscale to assess the impacts from a Nova Scotian perspective. We did a comprehensive vulnerability assessment back in 2005. Like I said, we take that information. We work with the best available science that comes to us. We work with other departments and communities to use that information to help guide our actions and our priorities. We have not done a comprehensive update on that, but through the work of the OAG, who's identified this as an opportunity, we've committed to do that in 2019. 2019. That's okay. So the taking action on climate change, I guess, document that the Auditor General highlighted and said that it didn't provide sufficient information. And also the Perspectives on Climate Change, and then we have the risk assessment. So they're all kind of, are they merging into a new approach, I guess, would you say? I think, as the Deputy mentioned, a significant portion of our focus right now on the mitigation side is to get the cap and trade program in place. That's a requirement of the federal government, and it's a fairly comprehensive program, so we're spending the majority of our resources on getting that in place. But also, as I mentioned earlier, adaptation still remains a significant focus. So we do. They go hand in hand, right? You can't kind of
That's correct. I mean, it's important for us to transition to a low carbon future and to contribute to the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there's no doubt that the impacts of climate change are going to continue. I think that we're seeing that right now here in Nova Scotia, and we may be seeing that more than some other regions, given the fact that we do live on the coast and we do experience some of these more extreme weather events, sea level rise, extreme precipitation patterns more frequently in the future. So we do need to continue to work on those.
Order. Time has expired. Move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. And I wanted to just ask a quick follow-up to Mr. Hollett. We talked about cap and trade and fuel oil being captured or being covered under that cap and trade. But I'm wondering how the department is working with transportation and infrastructure renewal to reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions by smart decisions around placement of public infrastructure, investment in highways, and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great question, and those types of policy decisions do have impacts on transportation issues in the province. Sustainable transportation issues are more a policy focus of our colleagues at Department of Environment, but we do work closely with them on their work. From the perspective of the cap and trade program, really what we're trying to do is to provide an incentive to companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions overall. We're not prescriptive on the methods how they should be reducing that. One of the things that a cap and trade program does do is it allows the lowest cost GHG reduction options to float to the surface. And that's something that you rely on the private sector to do, that government doesn't make those types of decisions for the private sector.
Thank you.
The Honourable Dave Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I want to go back to Chapter 1, the accounting of contaminated sites. And I know in the Auditor General's report was indicated that the total liability for the province in 2017 was $212 million, which most of that, the $198 million, pertains to two sites, and that's Boat Harbour and Cisco. And we know that increase from the prior year about 24%. So what's the expected liability for the 2018? And I know we're going through budget estimates, but I probably won't have an opportunity to ask questions in environment. So wondering what the total liability for 2018 will be. Is it still around that $212 million, or has it increased?
Ms. Martin.
That's a good question. I know that material is in front of us here this morning. Just to explain our role, we are the regulator, and so our role is to ensure that that the requirements of the Environment Act and the Contaminated Sites regulations are followed. The question you're asking, I believe, is really more a question for the Department of Finance and/or the Department of Transportation.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, and we're going to try to get the finance. I don't know if we'll make it there, so I thought I'd give it a shot here if it was something in front of you. So similar to the costs of Boat Harbour and stuff, would that wouldn't be something that you would have in front of you? I guess more or less you respond to the audit and in the work that's being done. Is that correct? You wouldn't know potentially what costs are involved this year in the cleanup for Boat Harbour?
No, we're not involved at all on the accounting or costing side of these projects. As the regulator, we would review what's proposed and ensure that the commitments are met under the Environment Act. Okay,
thank you for that. Some of the work from the Auditor General's reports are beneficial to us, because in more recent times they give 5 questions Nova Scotians would ask. So I will take a couple of those from the Auditor General report that is provided to members of this committee, and one of them is, and I thought I knew the answer, so I'm interested to see if it is anything different. It was who was responsible to clean up contaminated sites for organizations like the Nova Scotia Health Authority and IWK. I would assume that would just fall on the province, but is there, do you have a specific answer? Who would be responsible for those cleanups for NSHA and IWK sites if there was contamination found?
We would look to those particular organizations, the Nova Scotia Health Authority or the IWK. If they have a contaminated site, it would be their responsibility. They may confer and consult with the Department of Transportation, but it would be primarily those organizations that we would look to if it was contamination related to property that they owned and managed.
Okay, thank you for that. I know that we have kind of a short timeline here on the second round. Just wondering, since we have you in front of the committee, what role your department has when other departments are creating legislation that could impact the environment, for example, and more recently is changes to the Mineral Resource Act that is in front of the House, going through the process and dealing with potential mining site in Nova Scotia. Do you have a role? Do you play a role? Were you consulted by I think it's Department of Natural Resources it falls under, when they're proposing changes to legislation that will have an impact on the environment? I wonder if you could give maybe a quick response to that.
Yeah, so we can have a couple of different roles based upon the example you just used. We, with our protected areas group, they would have a certain perspective and role and interest in legislative proposals that would be advanced related to mining. We would also have our staff under Andrew's group that might look at it in terms of contamination of oil, soil, air, and water. And then the third area, and it really depends upon the specifics of what's being proposed under Adrian's group. His group is the field service that is out around the province that is there for inspection and compliance, and they might be interested in the proposal based upon how do you write it in such a way that that it's mostly easily to enforce and the requirements are clear. So we might have a variety of perspectives on a given piece of legislation that goes forward that might relate to the mandate of our department.
Would it be, and I know that we have all these different pieces of legislation, would it be beneficial to ensure that even though it's the Mineral Resource Act, that there are protections of the environment in that act? And the reason I ask, we had law amendments. I had the opportunity to sit in the committee, and we heard from a number of residents from the Wentworth Valley who are concerned about proposed gold mining project there. And not one of them said they were against mining, against the economic spin-off of that type of work, but they were concerned about their waterways and watershed and where they get their water, and there was a number of them that proposed changes to the or an amendment to the Mineral Resource Act that would make sure that the waterways are a concern when mining projects are permitted. And it was kind of indicated that should be in another piece of legislation. Other legislation covers that type of protection. But to me, I would think, the more protection we have and more legislation, hopefully it minimizes the negative impact to our environment. Would you agree with that, or are we off base where those kind of amendments and changes should be in a separate act, and we shouldn't have something like the Mineral Resource Act be strong on talking about the environment and protecting it?
I certainly agree with a number of points, and that is when it comes to a mining project or another project of that sort of magnitude, protection of our water and other natural resources is extremely important. Also important when developing legislation that we don't unduly or inappropriately have duplication. For mining projects, vast majority of mining projects do trigger an environmental assessment. And so that's an opportunity to look quite broadly, not just at soil and water and so on, but migratory birds and other important species. So that's a comprehensive process. And as I indicated earlier, at the end of an environmental assessment, if the project's approved, very, very often there's an extensive list of terms and conditions that are necessary in order for that project to go forward. Then if the company chooses to move forward on that basis, the next stage is often an industrial approval, and that's where we would ensure that all of the specifics around a specific water course and so on are taken into account and protected.
I appreciate that. I think it's I think the residents of that area are just concerned, and here it was an opportunity for them to be in front of a committee of the House to talk about impact of the environment when we see development or work being done in their area. Another area of concern, I know we won't have much time, was a recent clear cut in the Wentworth Valley, where residents, people that use that area for pleasure, really notice a difference in the waterways and some of the rivers after the clear cut. What role does the department play ensuring that when that type of project goes ahead, that the impact isn't what the residents have been seeing, and hence why they're so concerned about potential mining project?
Yeah, so again, in terms of forestry practices or any other practice that may relate to land-based activities that have the impact to negatively impact on our waterways, we do have requirements in our regulations and policy, guidelines in terms of best practice. We have a fair amount of educational material as well. Every year the department puts a considerable amount of effort into how do we communicate the requirements for protection of the environment, you know, whether it's contaminated sites or water course protection, what have you. We have regulations. They can be hard to read sometimes, but we translate a lot of that information into fairly simple to read requirements. So
time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Gordon Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much today for being here. I'd like to start off first by saying that I have all the extreme confidence in your department and what you're doing. It's been a privilege to sit on public accounts, and you've been here a few times. I see that you're coming back next week, actually, not you, but the AG is coming back on his report 2014-2015, and I believe water is going to be in that as discussions. Again, I do want to congratulate your department also. The report that came out yesterday on the Climate Change Action Plan can't be understated, I don't think. It's a report card, and it's a good report card. I think my concern will be with other provinces in why aren't they doing what Nova Scotia has been leading in. So thank you on that. Here to congratulate, but also here to question. I do have some areas I think that are important to touch on. I noted there were 47 different submissions in here in the report, either that we were working in progress towards or completed or other various places where the AG agreed in what we were doing. There were two that I did want to ask on. One was on 3.2 right off the bat. the division should establish procedures to obtain objective evidence to validate the accuracy of monitoring reports received from the approval holders, and you did not intend to implement that. Could you give us a reason why that's not in the best interest of the department to implement that one?
Ms. Martin?
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some clarification on that piece. Our department is mandated to protect public health and the environment. And it is a department that, through the course of our work, invariably we're involved in some pretty significant technical and scientific matters and discussions related to how do we ensure that we have appropriate protection, and in cases in contaminated sites, for example, how do we how do we regulate, how do we ensure that responsible parties are doing what they need to do. And so to strike the balance between ensuring that our department is looking at and spending our time on the most important areas of risk, and that we have the time to focus on that. An important part of the how we've developed, for example, the contaminated sites regulations, is we do rely upon professionals. And that's professionals in the private sector. Many of them would be working in consulting companies. These would be engineers, geoscientists, hydrogeologists, and a variety of other people with significant technical expertise. They are regulated by their professional bodies, and considering that, it means that they have professional obligations to conduct themselves according to the requirements of that profession. So we felt that in terms of the oversight that we provide on the reports and information that's provided to us, we do review and scrutinize the information that's submitted to us. But in this case, we didn't feel it was appropriate to have oversight on the professionals who in fact do already have some pretty significant oversight in terms of their professional bodies. So that's why we landed where we did on that particular one. I will say, though, that for any individual that supplies the department either false or misleading information, that it is an infraction under the Environment Act, and we have pursued that in the past, where if we felt that in an instance that we were supplied misinformation, but we do feel that the professionals in Nova Scotia that do have oversight from their professional bodies are supplying appropriate information.
Thank you. Yes, no, I do remember in your opening remarks that you talked about the evaluations by professional experts. I should have assumed that that was part of the answer. The second one is section 5.8. The Department of Environment should obtain documented acknowledgement from facilities that they have received the audit report. Can you, that's the only other one that I was curious about. Can you give me a status on that?
Sure, I'll ask my colleague Adrian to speak to that one.
Mr. Fuller?
Yes, thank you. No, it's a great question, and the status of that, how we're responding to that, is that most times when inspectors are in the field doing those audits, the proponent or the person that owns that property or that well is there, so it's often hand delivered. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes that's a cost that we it comes with not announcing when you're coming to conduct an audit, because we want to make sure we get the coverage and get there when we need to. So really in the follow-up on any audits where there is some concerns or issues or deficiencies, we would follow up with a directive requiring them to do something. So that kind of triggers our process to go down that compliance pathway if we need to. And that directive or that ask of them to do something is either, again, we go back and hand deliver it, or we deliver it by registered mail. So they are followed up on and they do get those reports. And then that starts us down that pathway. Hopefully they'll comply, but it also triggers us to follow up on those. issues.
Okay, thank you. So there were 47 recommendations in that report. If I can, and I do feel comfortable in your answers to those too, I would almost have to say that every single one of those recommendations in there are either completed or moving towards completion with dates set, or just not applicable to it. So again, I do commend you on that and look forward to hearing the AG's response next week. One thing that was touched on, but it wasn't as part of a question to within other areas. You'd mentioned about SNAP, and but you weren't asked specifically about that. It sounds to me like it's an integral part of meeting a lot of the requirements that you had that were identified. Can you tell me where it's at right now? I believe it's being implemented in 2 phases. I think it is, but can you just give me an overview of where we're at with that and what more needs to be done?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be glad to speak to the system that we've been working on for some time. We do have current systems, but like many organizations, they serve their time. And then beyond that, there are requirements that we have. And in the context of this discussion, the benefit of an Auditor General review is that we have recommendations that move us to continue to modernize our programs. And a lot of that in today's age is how do you house that inside an information management system that helps the organization do a better job, more consistent, better quality job of the core business of the organization. So we have about 150 regulated activities that we reviewed, and so that relates to everything under the Environment Act, plus a few things that we're starting to import from some of the activities that have come to the department in the recent past. And so this system went live about a year ago inside our department, and that allows the staff in our department that are involved in providing industrial approvals or other approvals to have that information on their computer, to attach all the associated reports that may be required, and also to help focus our staff that need to do inspections because the requirements inside the various approvals pop up, and it's built upon the high-risk activities get the most and frequent inspections, and the lower risk activities obviously get proportionately a little less attention. But what's important is that it's all housed inside that system. And so this is really, IT systems sometimes aren't the most exciting to talk about, but what it really does is position us to make sure that we understand all of our requirements, that we have all of our documentation together, and that that we're out doing the inspections and doing the follow-up work that we know is important in terms of environmental and human health protection. So I guess the other piece of this story in terms of the next phase, and that will happen later in the coming fiscal year, is that this system will go live to the outside world. It's not unusual for a new system to be using it internal to the organization as we start to perfect our expertise and make sure that it's functioning the way it was designed. But in the latter part of the coming fiscal year, companies that now apply to us on paper and you know, pay us in the old-fashioned ways, will be able to use this system that we refer to as SNAP. They'll be able to do that online, and we're connected with Service Nova Scotia, so a lot of the what we refer to as tombstone data in terms of a business name, an address, the property identification, and all of that information that we've heard from the business community that we have to, you know, every time we go to a different department or every time we go to the same department, we have to. Right.
Closing comments, you're welcome to continue along the same vein that you've been answering that question. You do have some moments for closing comments.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, in closing, I would just like to point to that in a very short time, we've made some very significant progress in addressing the Auditor General's recommendation. We welcome the recommendations of the AG. We take them seriously, and we have acted upon them. Our actions on environmental assessment, for example, are very nearly complete, and our actions on climate change will be completed within the next fiscal year. Beyond those two reports, we have addressed more than half of the recommendations from the previous audits, and we have an aim to finish them in the coming year as well. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your questions here this morning and an opportunity to discuss our progress on those recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Martin, to you and your colleagues for being with us this morning answering questions. We have received correspondence from 4 departments: Department of Environment, Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage, from the Department of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal, and from the Nova Scotia Health Authority pertaining to meetings, recent meetings. Is there any questions or comments on that correspondence? Hearing none. Our next meeting is on April 4th, next week, with the Office of the Auditor General to discuss follow-up of their 2014 and 2015 recommendations. Is there any further business to come before the committee? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.